Bonjour à tous. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Learn French with Madame. Today's episode, we're going to talk about les verbes réfléchis, reflexive verbs. So buckle up and let's talk about reflexive verbs. So the first thing I want to talk about is what is a reflexive verb. I'm going to talk about it in English and in French. In English, let's start with that first. So in English, a reflexive verb is just used to express when an action is happening to that person. So for example, if I say I brushed my hair or I brushed my teeth, etc., etc. In French, it's the same thing. When that person performs and receives the action of the verb, that is the reflexive verb. So basically, the person has to perform and receive that action. I can't say I'm washing the dog because the dog is receiving the action. I'm not washing myself, I'm washing the dog. So just make sure that you can tell the difference of when something is a reflexive and when something isn't a reflexive. A really good way to tell is the action happening to you and are you doing the action? Okay, so reflexive verbs in French have to have a reflexive pronoun, just like we do in English. So I'm washing myself, he is washing himself. In English, those reflexive pronouns are himself and myself and yourself, etc., etc. So just like in English, in French, reflexive verbs also have reflexive pronouns that go with each subject, just like in English. So let's talk about what those pronouns are. So the reflexive pronouns for je, you're going to use me. Tu is te. Il, elle, on, se. Nous, nous. Yes, you read that right. It is repetitive, but it's nous, nous. And vous. So you just take your subject and repeat it. And then il, elle, se for the plural. So I know this might look like a lot, but out of all of these, you really only have to know 5. Because you've got me, te, se, nous, and vous. Because the il, elle, on singular is the same as the il and elle plural. And so I have an example of where your reflexive pronoun is going to go in your sentence. It's always going to go right before your verb. Right before your verb. So we have je me lave les mains. Je me lave les mains. I am washing my hands. So je me lave les mains. All right, so let's do an example together. I have the verb se laver, which is to wash oneself. So like you wash yourself in the shower. So se laver. And I conjugated it for all of our subject. So we have je me lave, tu te laves, il se lave, elle se lave, on se lave, nous lavons, vous lavez, and il, elle se lave. So just like or what we've been talking about, these reflexive verbs are still going to conjugate like they would normally for the present tense. So you don't have to worry about any super weird conjugation for these. They're going to conjugate normally. The only difference now is that you're adding in your reflexive pronoun. So you could say je lave la voiture. You already know the verb laver. So je lave la voiture. I washed the car. To just say that you washed yourself, you say je me lave. That's it. Let's do an example together. I guess before we start that, let's talk about where they go in the negative. So in the negative, you have to place your reflexive pronoun and your verb inside your burger of the ne and pas. So like normal in sentences, when they're not negative and they're positive, you would say je me lave les mains. But when you're making something negative, you would put your ne and your pas around your verb. The only difference with reflexive pronouns and reflexive verbs is that your pronoun, that me, te, nous, vous, or se, is going to go in between that ne and the pas with your verb. So that's why I said your reflexive pronoun is always going to go before your verb. So your ne is still going to go before the me, and the ne is still going to go before the se. So I have I have 2 examples here. We have je ne me lave pas les mains. I am not washing my hands. That's méchant. That's bad. Wash your hands. And numéro 2, il ne se lave jamais avant 10 heures. Il ne se lave jamais avant 10 heures. So he never gets up before 10 o'clock. Oh, c'est trop tôt. That's very late. Okay. So exemple, j'ai 3 exemples, and you're going to answer these questions. You're going to fill in the blank with the correct form of your reflexive verb conjugated to your subject. So for numéro 1, I have se laver. So all you have to do is conjugate se laver and give me the right reflexive pronoun for nu. Okay, so I'm going to give you a second to fill that in. Okay, so we have nu blank les cheveux avec du shampooing. So we are saying that we're washing our hair with shampoo. So we should have put nous lavons les cheveux avec du shampooing. Numéro 2, our example or our sentence is je blank les cheveux, and se peigner is your reflexive verb that I gave you in parentheses. Se peigner is just the verb to comb. So you're going to say, I comb my hair. So you should have put je me peigne les cheveux. Je me peigne les cheveux. Numéro 3, we have elle blank pour aller à l'école, and se dépêcher is your reflexive verb. Se dépêcher just means to hurry oneself along, like to hurry oneself or to rush oneself. So go ahead and conjugate se dépêcher to elle. All right, you should have put elle se dépêche pour aller à l'école. Okay, let's do a couple more examples. So this first one, numéro 4, I have Shakir et son frère blank les dents avant de quitter la maison. And se brosser is the verb, the reflexive verb that I gave you in parentheses. So go through conjugate se brosser for Shakir et son frère. All right, you should have put Shakir et son frère se brossent les dents avant de quitter la maison. And your answer is se brosse right here. Numéro 5, to blank à quelle heure? We have se réveiller. Se réveiller is to wake oneself up. Now in French, this is just a little tidbit extra. In French, there's two different verbs. There's one that you wake up and there's one where you get up. So I know in English we say, oh, I get up at 6 o'clock, and we're talking about you waking up. And then we say, I get out of bed. But in French, you'd use se réveiller to say that you wake up, like your eyes open, you're awake, and se lever to say that you get up out of bed. So go ahead and conjugate se réveiller to tu. All right, we should have put tu te réveilles à quelle heure? Tu te réveilles à quelle heure? All right, so with reflexive verbs, there are some that are spell changers. However, you have already seen these verbs before, and you've learned the spell changing verbs before. You just haven't learned them as a reflexive verb. So the first one I want to talk about is se lever. So se lever is the verb to get up. Se lever, the verb to get up. Just like I said, we had se réveiller, which means to wake up. Se lever is the verb to get up. You've already learned how to conjugate this verb back in French 1 when you learned accent changing verbs like acheter and préférer. So this verb conjugates just like acheter, where it doesn't start off with an accent, but it gets one in the boot. So je, tu, il, elle, on, and il, elle, plural all get an accent grave inside the boot when you conjugate it. Nu and vous, you leave it alone. There's no accent. All right, up next is s'appeler. S'appeler is the verb to call oneself. We've seen this in French 1 a lot when we said je m'appelle, tu t'appelles, il, elle, on s'appelle, etc., etc. Appeler, s'appeler is a spell changing verb, meaning it starts off with one L, but in the boot form, so je, tu, il, elle, on, and il, elle, plural, you add another L. So it's je m'appelle, tu t'appelles, il, elle, on s'appelle. And then nous nous appelons, vous vous appelez, and il, elle s'appelle. So example down at the bottom there is je m'appelle Eric. Okay, so another accent changing verb is se sécher, which is the verb to dry. So se sécher is the verb to dry oneself. So we could say je me sèche, I'm drying myself. And sécher is an accent changing verb like préférer, where it starts off with an accent aigu and it changes to an accent grave. So se sécher, to dry, changes to je me sèche. Tu te sèches, il, elle, on se sèche. Nous, nous séchons. Vous, vous séchez. And il, elle se sèche. So in that boot form, the je, tu, il, elle plural, we're going to take our accent aigu and change it to an accent grave. All right, so remplissez les casse-vides avec le bon forme. So now we're going to work with reflexive pronouns or reflexive verbs that change spelling or change accents. So I have 3 examples here for you. We're going to go one by one and conjugate them all together. So for numéro 1, we have tu blank comment, and I gave you the verb s'appeler. So you're going to have to conjugate s'appeler to tu. I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about it. All right, we should have written tu t'appelles comment. Tu t'appelles comment? What is your name, or what do you call yourself? Tu t'appelles comment? What is your name, or what do you call yourself? Numéro 2, we have je blank tout de suite, and the verb is se lever, se lever. So go ahead and conjugate se lever to je. All right, so we should have put je me lève tout de suite. Je me lève tout de suite. Remember that se lever is just like acheter. It doesn't start off with an accent, but it gets an accent grave in that boot form. Numéro 3, we have nous blank les cheveux and the verb se sécher. So conjugate se sécher to nous. All right, you should have put nous séchons les cheveux. Nous séchons les cheveux. All right, and Madame was bad. I did not put my accent on my infinitive over here, but there's an accent aigu. Okay, et 3 others. Numéro 4, elle blank Marie, and the verb s'appeler. Numéro 5, vous blank à quelle heure with se lever. Numéro 6, il blank trop tard with se réveiller. So I'm going to give you a second to go through and conjugate all 3 of these, and then we're going to go over them together. Okay, so for numéro 4, we should have put elle s'appelle Marie. Numéro 5 should have been vous vous levez à quelle heure? So you get up at what time? Numéro 6 should have been il se réveille trop tard. They wake up really late. Okay, so reflexive verbs in the passé composé. We're going to talk about this a lot more later on, but I just wanted to introduce it a little bit, like dip your toes in the water. So all reflexive verbs in the passé composé are going to use être, no matter what. They will all use être if it's a reflexive verb. In most cases, your past participle is going to agree in gender and number with your reflexive pronoun and your subject. I put the and your subject in parentheses because if it's agreeing with your reflexive pronoun, it's obviously agreeing with your subject. So what I mean by in most cases, I mean the past participle is only going to agree when it's a direct object, when your past participle is the one receiving the action of the verb. So, for example, I have 2 exemples. Elle s'est lavé les cheveux. Elle s'est lavé les cheveux. There's no agreement because it's not there's no direct object. So, les cheveux is the direct object. So, if you ask yourself the question, what is getting the action of the verb or what is being washed? It's her hair. The second example, elle s'est lavée. There is an agreement because we're asking what is being washed. She is being washed. So your past participle is your direct object there. So we'll talk about that a lot more later on, but I just wanted to kind of give you a little intro to it. That is it for today with the passé composé and reflexive verbs, specifically just reflexive verbs. We'll talk about the passé composé and les verbes réfléchis later on, but now you know, just a little heads up. Reflexive verbs are pretty much the same as they are in English. They mean that the person is performing and receiving the action. There's reflexive pronouns that agree with your subject. So, je, me, tu, te, il, elle, on, se, nous, vous, and il, elle, se. And in reflexive verbs, The reflexive pronoun goes right next to your verb in between the negative, that ne and pas. And the most important one is that reflexive verbs will use être in the passé composé. And we'll talk about that a lot more later on. Mais c'est tout. Si vous avez des questions, if you have any questions, envoyez-moi un email. C'est tout et à plus.